Calling to order the Planning Commission meeting. Good evening and welcome to the June 15th meeting of the West Sacramento Planning Commission. Tonight's agenda is available on the counter along with request to speak cards. A reminder to everyone that request to speak cards should be completed and turned into the clerk right over here prior to the completion of any staff presentation. For those speakers wishing to speak on items not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of this commission, please write the item number on your card. All speakers will be limited to 3 minutes. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and televised, so all speakers, in order to be recognized, must be called on by the chair and come forward to the microphone right here. Speaking in public may cause some individuals to be uncomfortable, so everyone is asked to be professional and respectful at all times. We will start this evening with a Pledge of Allegiance led by Commissioner Liebig.
Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We will start with general administrative functions. A, presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of this commission. The commission is prohibited by law from discussing issues not on the agenda brought to them at this time. I see none. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to comment on something that is not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move to item B, correspondence and staff communication from the Planning Commission Secretary, Mr. Tilley.
Yes, no correspondence tonight.
Excellent, thank you. Item C, disclosure of ex parte communications. Planning commissioners should disclose any communications they have had on the agenda items at this time, and I'll start to my left.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have had limited email correspondence with the applicant for item number 5.
Thank you. Commissioner Vu? I have had conversations with the applicant for item number 5 as well. Vice Chair Sternfels?
I have also met with the applicant for item number 5.
Commissioner Castillo?
I have also had conversation with the applicant regarding item number 5.
Thank you. Commissioner?
I have email and conversation as well.
Thank you. Make a note of that. We have our consent and then regular agenda items. There has been a request to move regular agenda item number 4 to the end and moving up agenda item number 5. Is there any discussion on that? Do we need to move that, or is that sufficient?
You can move consent.
All right, so I'll entertain a motion to entertain our agenda items 1, 2, 3, and then 5, and then 4.
I'll move recommended change.
Have a motion and a second. So a motion by Commissioner Liebig, a second by Vice Chair Sternfels. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Any abstention? The motion carries. We'll start with item 1 on the consent agenda, approval of the minutes.
Chair, are we taking the entire consent agenda together, or are we going to take items separately?
That's right. Thank you for that. Is there anyone who has any interest in pulling anything from the consent calendar?
No.
Okay. And with that, I will entertain a motion to approve items 1, 2, and 3 from the consent agenda.
I will move that we approve item number 1 and ratify the zoning administrator action on items number 2 and 3.
One second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Liebig and a second from Vice Chair Sternfels. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Any abstentions? Motions 1, 2, and 3 carry. And now we'll move on to item 5, which is a workshop on proposed municipal code amendments for cannabis manufacturing, distribution, transportation, and indoor cultivation facilities in the heavy industrial zone. Looks like this be from Mr. Tilley or from Ms. Hamilton?
I'll be handling this one, although I may ask for some help from Director Hamilton on this item. So as you stated, we are here tonight for a workshop for some proposed municipal code amendments related to cannabis. So this is a similar nature to what we conducted at your previous meeting, and this particular project would seek to amend our municipal code to permit cannabis manufacturing, distribution, and indoor cultivation in our heavy industrial zone. The applicant has a property on Seaport Boulevard, which is in the area just west of the port's turning basin in the heavy industrial zone, and they are proposing to conduct these uses in this particular building should the municipal code amendments be approved. These would be three separate licenses, as what we expect, possibly a fourth license from the state for each of these uses. And so part of what we'll be ultimately bringing forward to you would be separate development agreements and use permits for each of the three phases. So each one could be, we would consider them as a group, but each use would be technically separate based on the state licensing structure that's being currently devised at the state level. The municipal code amendments would be similar to some of the other projects we have considered in that it would define a land use, establish it as a conditionally permitted use in one or more of the industrial zones, and then also require a development agreement, establish requirements for a security plan and other details, and then these uses subsequent uses would come before the Planning Commission with a use permit and development agreement request. We would propose to carry all of these together for the Planning Commission's consideration, and then since ultimately the City Council would make the final decision on any municipal code amendments and development agreement. Speaking of the City Council, they are scheduled to take up zoning matters related to cannabis uses at their upcoming meeting. We're handling each one of these projects, as they've come to us and as we're required to under Permit Streamlining Act. But the council will provide some additional guidance on this topic coming up soon. But we are still processing each individual cannabis project application that we have received, of which now we have 3 currently. So this will be the second one you have seen, and then there'll be another one coming at a later meeting. So we've established some draft, working definitions for a cannabis manufacturing facility, distribution, transportation facility, indoor cultivation facility. These are a work in progress, but this is sort of at least the general feeling of where we would go from a definition standpoint. And then we would also establish some additional language in the municipal code for these facilities that establishes the requirement for the development agreement, public safety security plan, no signage, things of that nature. Very similar to what we proposed with the prior project and also with the River Wellness project that the commission considered last year. So this does involve a use we haven't talked about yet, which is cultivation. This is something that will be permissible under the new state regime for cannabis uses. And so all of these would be under the same roof, although technically separate entities. So we addressed the only outstanding issue we had really at least at the time of drafting a staff report, where this was the one overall development agreement or separate one. So we have sort of reached a conclusion on that with City Attorney's Office and the applicant about doing separate development agreements, albeit very, very similar, related to each facet of their operation. So with that tonight, I'm happy to answer questions this time. What the PowerPoint's on screen is the applicant's presentation, so we would ask that you also hear a short presentation from the applicant and their team.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tilley. I just want to remind folks in the audience, if you are not with the applicant and would like to comment on this, there are request to speak cards that can be turned in right here to my right, and we can hear from the applicant. And make sure that you introduce yourself and anyone else that comes up subsequently.
Thank you so much, Chair Austin. My name is Daniel Conway, and I'm with Truth Enterprises. First of all, I want to thank you all for the evening, or the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I also want to thank staff for all the work that they've done to get us here to this point. Before I go too much further, I actually did want to take a minute to introduce my team here, my partners. So first of all, we have our attorney, Jeff Dorso, with Pioneer Law Group. Don't know if you can hear me. Next to him, we have Brian Hansen, Alexis Williams, Ross Haley, Jake Hendrickson, and then our general contractor, Keone Allen. So we're all here today, obviously recognizing this is the start of the conversation, so to the extent you guys have questions or things, we all wanted to be present. I'll be real brief, and then I'll hand it over to Jeff. We started this company about 1.5 years ago, and one of the first things people ask us is, Truth. Why call your company Truth? And for us, we set out from the beginning that we wanted to be transparent and we wanted to provide leadership at this industry. And I think we all recognize that this is an industry that is quickly evolving, and we recognize from the outset that we needed to reset the conversation. That there was a lot of stigma, a lot of I think baggage, if you will, from kind of where marijuana's come from, and we wanted to be able to focus much more on where marijuana is going. And so from the outset, we set out to be industry leaders, and we wanted to be able to kind of show what a modern cannabis industry could be. So with that in mind, we actually partnered with the University of Pacific last year to work on an economic development study for the Sacramento region, because we recognized that we needed something more than just us making the case. We needed to really be able to paint a picture for policymakers such as yourselves about kind of the true potential of this industry. But once we completed that study, we recognized that a study is just that. It's something that kind of can identify opportunities, but until steps are taken, they're just potential. So for us, we set out to develop projects ourselves to show, again, what was possible. So long story short, that's kind of what brings us here tonight. We, recognized West Sacramento as, a hub of industry in our region, and particularly for a business like this, which is going to be kind of focused on logistics and manufacturing, this just seemed like the right place to be. And so, again, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but I mean, when you look at this building, you look at the location, 55,000 square feet, secure distribution facility with a rooftop of solar panels, it was just too good to be true. So again, we're going to talk more a little bit about the 3 different uses and why we're there, but for now, I'd like to hand it off to my friend Jeff Dorso.
Good evening, Commission. Jeff Dorso, representing the applicant. It's nice to see so many familiar faces up there. Let's see, this is going to test my intellect here if I get this one right. Okay, yes, 1 point for me. Okay, so my job here really is to be short. Staff gave you a very detailed staff report laying out the project, laying out kind of the size of the building, the site plan for the building, the uses within the building. So really our hope tonight is 1, to be brief, 2, to give you a little bit of context to that report. We felt it was very important to have everyone here to answer questions. And really our hope is give you a short presentation and then hopefully be able to answer questions that the commission may have, and also be able to take feedback that you may have to when we come before you again for the ultimate approvals. So there's really 3 points that we wanted to hit, which was, and Daniel hit some of them, but it's, who is Truth? How do they do what they do? And where are they going to do it? And some of those have been answered already. Daniel hit on the genesis of their name, I think, which is critical, but really goes to what they wanted to do, which was to set an industry standard in a new industry. And so what they did first was put together, frankly, a very impressive team, kind of ranging in skill sets, just like you would any other business. Ross Haley has deep experience in growing companies. His companies have gone from startup to ultimately sale to large publicly traded companies. He's an accomplished executive and has a thorough understanding of how to assemble a team. Brian Hansen has over 30 years of experience as a CFO, has been in the startup sector, the tech sector, and really brings that experience to bear. That's separate from industry specific, but really brings kind of the world experiences for each skill set. Jake Hendrickson is the farmer, if you will, on the team. He is the one who has the expertise with respect to cultivation. He's been growing in the cannabis industry for over 20 years and has tremendous expertise there. And then, of course, Daniel, who each of you know, who has a strong history in government relations and in general municipal functionings from his experience as a former chief of staff. So these are all principals on the Truth team who are here to also answer questions kind of in each respective sector, all sort of play the MC role, if you will, and then either answer questions or bring up the respective person. We also have a development team. So the second thing they did is they put together their team and said, who are we going to hire to try to deliver this project and other projects that they're looking at working on. I feel very fortunate that I was selected as their attorney. I have the benefit of working on, many land use projects in the region. I've lived in West Sac for many years. Kevin Jasper is a West Sac industrial property expert who actually helped find this project. And then Ali Yousefi, who I think most of you know is a very accomplished urban developer who really brings one of the critical perspectives that Truth is really looking to exploit and will explain with respect to this project, but it has to do with how do you do smart development in a cannabis space. We often talk about infill development kind of globally, but that also applies within an industry sector. So one of the reasons for co-locating these uses, for example, is the same concept of why you'd co-locate uses in a mixed-use context, which is to reduce your vehicle miles traveled by internalizing those trips within a development. That same concept applies with respect to a cannabis business when you have different business segments like cultivation. Instead of driving that crop to a separate building that is going to then process or manufacture that product, you're able to process or manufacture that product in the same building, so you're taking out that truck trip or that vehicle trip. So it's an important concept, and Ali's really been instrumental in helping to put that together. And then Keone Allen, the general contractor, who's also here, as well as Sean Freitas, who's the architect. So kind of why West Sacramento? I mean, you guys are on the Planning Commission. You probably know this better than I do. But a couple reasons. One, strategic location of West Sacramento, kind of in the Central Valley, for the same reasons that it's naturally been a hub of manufacture and distribution in other industries. Those same facts kind of bear out in the cannabis industry and are very advantageous kind of in that regard. Secondly, and I think this is probably more important for Truth, but just the concept and desire to really lead from the front. And that's something that I think as a city, West Sacramento has done very well in other industries, and I think we'll look to do the same in this industry. And so they felt like this was a great city to kind of plant their flag for what they hope will be a flagship project for them. So the project, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because you have it in your report and you guys have probably all read that. But just to see the building, as Daniel mentioned, it's approximately 55,000 square feet. One of the pieces that made this attractive, again, thinking about that kind of urban infill mindset, is aside from the location, that one, it's a, unused, sort of empty, non-performing warehouse at this point. It's already built, so it's an infill location. It's underutilized. It has existing approximately 9,600 square feet of photovoltaic paneling on the roof, so the ability to produce its own, at least a portion of its own power, and a central location in terms of being able to then distribute to market. So there were a lot of elements that were essential kind of for this group. And then secondly, because of the size of 55,000 square feet, the ability to co-locate those uses to get the efficiencies of operation that really you don't have the opportunity to do in a lot of other circumstances. I mean, what you're seeing, for example, across the river is there's several cultivation sites and industrial buildings, but they're small one-off locations that then once you harvest a crop, you have to then drive that crop somewhere. And often multiple times. You have to drive it to the manufacturer, who then turns it into a product, who then has to drive it to a dispensary. So taking out at least one of those trips was important. So the building really kind of aligned particularly well with a lot of those goals that we've hit on for the applicant. This just goes through some of the general points that you've looked at. And then, of course, as an industrial building, handling what we feel is rightly an industrial use, and particularly with cultivation, I think the best practices model that we're seeing of, pulling that out of residential areas and locating that in industrial sectors is really makes a lot of sense for all the reasons we know in terms of safety, distribution, and other reasons. This just lays out kind of some of the points that we've hit on in terms of those urban infill concepts and the benefits of co-locating This is really just some of the context, that we don't get to put in the staff report, obviously. It is not necessarily the direct issue that you care about from a planning issue, but certainly it's very important to the applicant. And we think it's very important for the city of West Sacramento ultimately. So I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel. One of the things we wanted to hit quickly too, since we were one of the first projects, is just lay out briefly, and certainly for me it was educational as well, because I'm not in this business, I'm in the business of law, but what each of these really means. What does it mean kind of when someone says cultivation? What's an overview of that process? What's an overview of manufacturing? What does that mean? What is distribution? And then kind of from that, turn it into questions and just answer whatever issues you guys may have. Daniel?
Thank you. And again, I'll just try to be succinct here, but as Jeff said, just to kind of give you guys an overview. So, and a lot of this, frankly, comes from the UOP study, because they did a lot to kind of develop these models based on existing literature and input from people in the industry. But cultivation, this is agriculture. And so essentially there's three different forms. There's indoor, there's outdoor, and then there's mixed light greenhouses. From our perspective, the long-term future of cultivation in California is going to be outdoor and greenhouses, because we have the climate for it. I mean, just like you see all these other commodities growing up and down our state. But for us, we see an opportunity here in this location to do indoor cultivation because, one, as Jeff said, it has the infrastructure for it. But more importantly, indoor cultivation plays an important role in that it is the most controlled environment, obviously, to do this. And so we look at it as an opportunity to really innovate and incubate new ideas and best practices within the industry. I think you guys can recognize that this, cultivation and frankly, every aspect of this business to date has developed in a very constrained environment in terms of resources and visibility and things like that. And so when we look at this opportunity to do indoor cultivation here, we see it as a chance to just employ the best technology and, really do some leading edge stuff. And one of my partners here, Ross, he is a partner in a facility outside of Las Vegas that is it's fully licensed cultivation and manufacturing. So we've had the benefit of seeing that facility, which is a fantastic facility in its own right, and really learn from that. And we're excited to kind of see what we can do to take that to a next level, not just in the near term, but in the years to come. Manufacturing is one of those interesting things where I know, as someone who has been in this industry a relatively short period of time, there's a lot of questions about manufacturing and what does it mean. And you read these stories about someone in a storage container in the middle of nowhere blowing themselves up because they're trying to do something that they don't have the proper facilities to do. So what I've learned, and through the help of my partners and from talking to experts in the field, is that manufacturing marijuana is not much different than manufacturing any other commodity. So if you were taking olive oil, you would essentially put olives in one end of a machine, run it through, and you'd have oil come out on the other side. And so, for instance, having been to the facility in Las Vegas that I alluded to, you walk into the manufacturing room, it's like the size of a large walk-in closet with two really shiny, expensive machines that are just pumping. So the point is for us, we see a huge upside in manufacturing. Again, the UOP study does a great job of kind of elaborating the uses, both from, everything from like vape pens and oils to all the inputs that you need for edibles and things like that. So we see manufacturing just being critical to developing supply chain and really, again, developing the businesses in this sector. Lastly, distribution. I know you guys are familiar with that. You've heard from another licensed company here in the past. It's really as fundamental as the fact that, we have a lot of energy and effort being put in by policymakers and entrepreneurs in the state to develop these businesses. We're seeing a lot of existing retailers throughout the state, including this region. You're seeing a lot of cultivation licenses and projects getting developed. What's missing are all those links in between in the supply chain. And so that's where we feel that distribution is just absolutely fundamental to having a well-run and functioning commercial cannabis industry. So for us, again, that's why it's so important to develop these three businesses. And for all the reasons that Jeff alluded to, we see real value in locating them under one roof. So with all that being said, I'm now going to pass it back to Jeff so that he can engage in a Q&A with you guys. Thank you.
So that pretty much wraps up kind of our presentation. We just wanted to answer any questions kind of that you guys may have in terms of the project.
Excellent, thank you. So I actually will, so we can pose questions to city staff, to the applicant, and then is there a representative from public safety here as well? If there are any questions?
Our fire marshal's here tonight to help from his standpoint as well. Fortunately, I was unable to contact our police representative, but I would expect their comments would be similar to what we heard previously.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm actually going to start to my right with Commissioner Lepore.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And as I mentioned to the last group, whatever that was, last meeting, I think it was, that I really appreciate the, professional team that you have assembled and makes a big difference, especially in a new industry like this. So hats off to you guys for doing that. My only question really was on timing. Do you have a timeline in terms of once you get the green light?
Yes, so we purchased the building, so right away, you're, as you know, as a business owner, you're taking carry costs. So the goal would be, we submitted our application, is that about a month ago, give or take-ish? About a month ago. So I think, our hope would be, we get a decision, in July, August, something in that neighborhood, September, say. And then once we have that, and we really need to look at how we process kind of our building permit. So at some point, kind of once we've gotten the initial input from the city and from the city departments, we'll probably start looking on our side at kind of preparing that concurrently so that as soon as we get that approval, we can start the build out. So you'd probably, loosely kind of, I'd say end of Q4, beginning of Q1, probably be able to start getting the space in a condition that you can start getting stuff up and operational. But there's quite a bit of work interior with the TIs that has to be done, so that'll take a while.
Would you mind just fleshing out some of those acronyms, because I'm not sure that all the commissioners, people at home know what you're talking about with Q4 and
Oh,
TIs.
sorry, yes. So timing-wise, either like fourth quarter of this year to first quarter next year, in, say December to March-ish. And then in terms of tenant improvements, that's most of the work that has to be done is we'll process a building permit for those improvements and go into the building. And you saw from the site plan, there's, demising walls and other improvements that have to be put in place to make the building kind of function as we need it.
Thank you.
So best guess, and I mean, obviously it's development. Sometimes it's a moving target, but in terms of like doors open, operation.
Yeah.
It's fine. Actually, if you want to answer, come so that we can hear you in the mic.
You can
thank
come up, yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. I was just going to say, I mean, there's a reason our general contractor's sitting here.
Right.
I mean, we're going to start as soon as we can, period. And we're going to be open as quickly as we can.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Castillo.
Thanks for the presentation, and obviously the team that you've assembled is professional and definitely changing the perception of how these are seen across the region, because before this, obviously, like Daniel mentioned, there's a specific perception of these types of businesses opening up in various parts of the region and people are concerned about, but you shed a different light on that. My question, I guess, is, there's cultivation that's going to be happening at this particular facility. So can you talk a little bit more about, and maybe the fire department rep can talk just more a little bit about the safety plan or the safety variables that are going to be taken into account when developing something like that for this, particularly for the cultivation, given that I think previous applicants have not necessarily incorporated cultivation, so this is a new component that we are taking into account for this particular business. Can you address that?
Sure. So I think, the first thing we'll do is that our application's been circulated to the city staffs for input. So one of the processes is we'll get comments from police and fire in that process, and certainly look at, the building has some of those kind of, issues obviously built in from what was permitted previously in terms of roundabout access for fire trucks, things of that nature, but getting comments on the actual, to the extent cultivation plays an issue, or if there's ventilation questions or accessibility questions that the fire department has. Certainly, our intent is to sit down and then have those built into that process, which is part of the reason, kind of the dance on when we open, that'll be built into what our tenant improvement design looks like, and we just need to have those discussions to start that process. So I don't have a definite answer for you sitting here. I would probably defer to the fire department to the extent they may have specific comments kind of on that issue.
Evening, Madam Chair, members of the commission, Brian Johnson, Fire Marshal. With regard to the tenant improvements, we've got a book of codes that they would follow the minimum requirements with that. Not only that, this is a fairly new industry, but the processes are kind of similar from other industries that exist. And the fire code has actually developed another chapter to address this specifically, not so much cannabis, but plant extraction. With regard to the operation, they would be, if there was a permittable operation within the grand scheme of their proposal, if there was a qualification, we would require a permit for that, and we would conduct regular inspections to assure that they're doing that safely.
Thank you. I guess one more clarification, I guess maybe for Mr. Tilley. In terms of the M2 zoning, is this similar to the previous conversation we were having at the last meeting where changing the zoning or allowing this particular business for an M2 zone, would that change it for the entire, for all the M2 zones in the area to be able to have a business be able to apply or pick a location for that particular?
Yeah, that's our current proposal, is that this would amend the M2 zone for the whole city to where M2 already exists. It's not changing the zoning on anybody's property, but it's now allowing this new use within those areas that are already zoned M2. And we put a map in as attachment 1, and we do have a fair amount of M2, but it's primarily areas where this is located in the Enterprise and Seaport area. There are some other heavy industrial areas in town. I don't know how suitable many of those existing buildings would be for this type of use, but this is an area where the M2 is a fairly large portion of our city. And so, but if anyone else wanted to do this in M2, they would still be coming before you for a use permit and development agreement.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Strom-Fels.
So I want to apologize to the applicant in advance because I have questions for both, and comments for both city staff and the applicant. So I thought I'd start with the applicant. On cultivation, and I may have missed this in the staff report, so I apologize if I did, but are we talking about like hydroponic cultivation, or is this like beds and dirt, indoor cultivation?
It's indoor, the short answer, it's indoor cultivation in soil.
In soil.
Yeah.
And then, can you speak at all to like water use and how that would work both for the cultivation piece and from a wastewater perspective, if there's any from that process? I'm just not familiar with indoor cultivation in planters.
Sure. So one of the benefits of indoor cultivation is that's a very controlled environment. So it allows you to sort of maximize your efficiencies in terms of particularly water. You do have costs in terms of more electrical use, but again, as we pointed out, that was sort of one of the reasons this building was desirable, because of the self-generation through the rooftop solar. So from a water standpoint, you do have a use of water, which then, we would be required, just like any other business, to comply kind of similar to fire with all the required regional water quality control permits or other water quality permits in terms of how you use that water. We're still looking at how the applicant's going to develop kind of reuse of that. So in some operations, you have the ability to reuse that water and recycle that water. It just depends ultimately kind of how you end up laying out the grow and being able to utilize that. So that level of detail is not frankly known yet, because we're not, we have to get through the building permit process and get through that layout. But that's the short answer, is you'll be subject to all of the water quality standards that you already have in place.
Sure. And then on the soil side, colleague has more comments. Sure.
Ross Haley.
Yeah, Ross Haley. I just want to speak real quick to the kind of the method of growing
Please.
indoors. Indoors, as he mentioned earlier, has a lot more control. It's in a controlled environment. So we're always working towards increasing sustainability because water costs are high. You know, I understand drain water storage and all the other things that go along with if you have, you know, if you're releasing water with fertilizers, et cetera. The nice thing about a controlled environment like an indoor environment is you can actually water very precisely. So you have almost zero waste or drain of the nutrient-filled water to the plant. And we're always working on different methods. So he mentioned soil, but there's soilless, there's cocoa fiber, there's rock wool, there's all kinds of different plant mediums you can grow in. And we're always working towards finding mediums that not only produce a better plant, but also use less water, less fertilizer. And in a controlled environment, indoor situation, it's the best to do it in, so.
I appreciate that. Thank you. One more question probably for you, and then I have a question for our fire chief. So on the soil end, can you talk a little bit more about where soil is going to come from? Is it going to be stored in bulk anywhere? And then if it, you know, once you're done using the soil, what happens, or do you use it?
Sure. I have
just procedurally, it's helpful for us, I think, to understand some of those things.
Absolutely. I have a lot of knowledge around the supply chain in regards to the consumable products that go into these grows. We have access to local organic soils that are actually produced in a facility that I'm very familiar with north of here. And these are green waste products, so they're coming out of our compost facility in Placer County, most of it, all sustainable, reused material for the potting soils. That material is not reused typically in an indoor situation for the cannabis growing because we want to keep a sterile environment, but it's very usable as far as, you know, we compost it, so there's no cannabis in it, but it is composted and reused in gardens all over, right? So it can be reused. It's not disposed of. It's just it's recycled.
Okay. Thank you. And then maybe this may be for city staff or for the chief. In terms of like the sprinkler system, I know like when we do outdoor landscaping and stuff, we have the model water efficient landscaping ordinance in effect now, so we're testing those and ensuring that they're the most efficient products. Would we be applying those similar standards to an indoor grow facility?
Yeah, it's not really landscaping in that same context, the way the model efficient landscape ordinance is going.
Agreed.
Generally, we would look at water usage, and we have a certain assumption for daily water use by zoning use in heavy industrial. I think it's at least a few thousand gallons a day, I think, is the assumption for heavy industrial uses. So we want to be looking at this as compared to what we've assumed in our water model for that. That's something we'll look into further if the WELO is even something that we may be able to glean some information from and have it be applicable in a situation like this.
Thank you. And then just a few more quick questions for the applicant. You cited kind of economic development statistics in the presentation, employment. Do you have any employment numbers for what you're anticipating at the facility at full operation?
And one other issue just on that water question, we did analyze and look at the city's water study assumptions in their general plan EIR to confirm that we would be under that threshold that was assumed, and we got confirmation that that would be the case, so.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Brian Hanson. Thank you, Council, for entertaining us tonight. With regard to kind of an earlier question that Andrea had as well, the project plan and how soon we want to get started, we have a fully baked project plan in our possession right now that we've worked through. So the permitting process is key to moving that along, right, and not creating bottlenecks. So Jeff talked about Q4 to Q1. We'd like to actually get started even sooner than that if it's possible for the city to move even quicker. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of clarification on that. With regard to employment, it is a very labor-intensive process. Cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution. So our models call for tens, if not hundreds, of employees as we scale up the facility. So and we look to take advantage of the labor pool in West Sacramento to benefit our project accordingly. So this is a fairly labor-intensive project, and there's a lot of employees that we would look to, and that's why, the facility and the parking and all those things were important to us to be able to support that level of activity.
Thank you. I just have one more question for the applicant. I don't know who the best person to answer is, but I wanted to just talk a little bit on the distribution. So the previous applicant we've had come before us as a distributor, they were only distributing, they were buying products from growers or manufacturers, and then they're distributing them. Your concept sounds like you're trying to grow, manufacture, and distribute. My question is, are you only hoping to distribute the products you make, or are you planning to also distribute from other growers and producers? And kind of what's the balance or the split?
I'll leave that to Ross.
So similar to the business that I currently operate, we manufacture our own products and distribute those, but we treat our distribution business as a distribution business, and we take all opportunities to the table. So our relationships through the distribution business to the retailers or to the consumers allows us a supply chain or access for any other potential manufacturer. I think the exciting part for me when I look at West Sacramento is it is a very central location for where I believe a lot of licensed producers are going to be. When I say producers, I should say cultivators around the foothills, a lot of different counties around us. So I think we'll have a huge opportunity to not only manufacture, grow, and sell our own brands and materials, but we'll be able to do the same for a lot of other cultivators in the area as well.
So it doesn't sound like it's a primary part of your business plan, but it's certainly,
The distribution side?
or distribution of products other than your own.
Oh, it is absolutely a primary, yeah. Yeah, no, it's going to be, I think, a necessity and again, a huge opportunity, so.
So Chair, I have just some general comments for city staff and the commission. We can do those after everyone's done speaking with the applicant or now.
Thank you for bringing that up. I was going to say that I was going to focus on questions, but if we would like to, there will be an opportunity for our commissioners to provide comments, as this is a workshop, so for future things. So if you'd like to hold your comments.
I'm more than happy to.
Okay, great. Commissioner Liebig.
Thank you. I have a few pieces of paper around, so bear with me as I get through this. And I didn't separate mine in between staff and applicant, so you'll probably just get all of them at one time. I want to first make sure that we're consistent with our zoning. For example, this project has manufacturing. In the last project we worked on, which is manufacturing, we put them in M1. I'm sorry, it's the light industrial.
Yeah, the prior project, the one we heard last time, was in the limited industrial district, ML.
Which is a similar use to part of this project, and so we have an inconsistent land use. So I would want to make sure that, well, for example, if we're doing just manufacturing, should they be in ML as well as M2? Or is it just this is a special case because they're combining uses? This is a broader question that we don't need to answer tonight. I just want to make sure that we're considering our land uses, and as we're taking these projects, project by project, perhaps we're not, perhaps we need to look back and then make sure we're being consistent between the land use designations as we do this.
So I'll take this one on a little bit and provide a little bit of history. So the executive staff, during the council strategic planning session, the open session that was 3 days long in January, the end of January, we did take all the new state regulations from the Adult Use of Marijuana Act as well as the Medical Marijuana MRSA Act. There were some changes there. So we did look at all of those, take those to the council. We had a discussion with the council, and they did provide some direction on each of the license types based on what staff was recommending as far as changes to the municipal codes that we might have to do to either be in compliance with the new state regulations and/or should the council decide that they want to move forward with some amendments to allow some of these new uses that would be coming. And they basically kind of said, let's, for now, take them on a case-by-case basis as we get applications. So go ahead and process applications as they come forward. They gave a little bit of discretion to the city manager to kind of evaluate those applications as they come in, given that they were going to be requiring anticipating a development agreement. And so development agreements are voluntary on the part of both parties. So when we get these applications in that we have so far, they immediately go through the city manager's office before we even start working on them to make sure it's an application that even the city manager would recommend entering into a development agreement. And so we just received direction from the city manager to take back to the city council the same information on the license types and the municipal codes, to get that to them at the end of January, to check back in, and we'll be asking direction from the council whether they want us to start proceeding with some of the amendments at this time. We're likely going to, be careful to not get in the way of these applications that are in process. So allowing them to keep moving, because that's been the direction we've received to date. But if we should also get some direction from the council on any other amendments that they may want to entertain that are outside of these applications. So I don't know if that helps, but in January, when they did look at this and the staff recommendation with respect to these different license types, they did focus with respect to manufacturing, distribution, and cultivation, they focused in on the M zones. So that would include ML, M1, M2, and M3. So that's the direction we've had so far. But again, it's a public process, and I'm sure they're interested in hearing your comments tonight and input on this particular workshop and application.
Thank you, Charlene. And I know the applicant is in front of us right now. At the same time, we're discussing policy. So as we're thinking about your project, we're also having to look at policy because you are the first to propose this, and this is our first time to consider it. It would be nice to be able to have a comprehensive conversation about all of the business categories. So what we haven't talked about yet, and I know it's not part of yours, but we haven't talked about testing or sales. So it would be nice to get maybe feedback from council when they talk about those as well. Of the project specific, I'm probably most concerned with cultivation, partly because that's the new one for us. We've already talked about distribution. We've talked a little bit about manufacturing. You mentioned cultivation is like making olive oil a little bit. Not quite. The cultivation, or actually, I think you were talking about manufacturing of olive oil, but cultivation, one of the big concerns we've heard before, and one of the reasons that cultivation is indoor in our town, is because there's a smell related with growing cannabis. And I'm interested in hearing about
Ventilation.
the air quality and ventilation filters on the facility for the grow and for the extraction process, because the extraction process isn't you just squish the oils out. I believe you have to use chemicals or different gases maybe to extract the oil. So as far as that part, I would like to hear a little bit more about how we're going to watch the air quality to make sure that we don't get smells into the surrounding neighborhoods.
So, yeah, I think a great question, and I think there's a couple things. First, on the policy question kind of M2, which you were discussing with staff, that's also part of just from an applicant perspective as well, when we're looking at siting opportunities, obviously, we're tracking what's happening in the city kind of with the similar zoning and similar uses. And I think based on the actual use, for all the reasons we covered, it seemed like a really good fit for whatever that's worth. So just from a business use, user perspective, the ability of co-locating and using an M2 zone for those, I think was very helpful, just as general information for that discussion. For the second question on smell, so very good question, right? You know, that's one that I think every hearing body has on the issue, and certainly one that Truth is very cognizant of. So they have, and we would expect to have with city staff, conditions of approval on our permit that provide standards and thresholds to ensure that we comply with that. Operationally, you know, there's technologies that people use now, whether it's carbon filters or other designs that are pretty elaborate, that actually, you know, if you go and tour a cultivation site, you're standing right outside the front door and someone could be making TVs inside, or they could be cultivating. You really, truly would have no concept of that happening. So consistent with kind of what we've shared in terms of how Truth plans on conducting their business, we absolutely will work with staff to ensure there's appropriate conditions in the approval, that those standards are met, so that we're not creating a smell nuisance for anyone.
So just to comment, I guess, to staff is, based on comments that we've heard prior to your project from the public, I would consider the smell filters or whatever the important as far as the conditions on this project. Other considerations, just assuming moving forward, we'd want to consider the other measures regarding like signage, security, that were standard. I don't want to say standard, it's not like, but you know, because you're number 3, it's not like we've got a huge precedent, but that we've discussed and included prior to. Just kind of comments, I've gotten some like on the ground sense. We interact with our community, that's part of our job. And I did look up and actually talked with staff a little bit. So the voters in our city did approve the adult use of marijuana by over 61%. And that's for our city. So there seems to be a strong favor for this. Just chatting with other community members, they seem to be on board with our policy for manufacturing. They seem to be on board with policy for distribution. Those were very easy discussions to have. With sales, I'm finding mixed. I'm just getting mixed feedback, which is interesting. That's actually better than it was before, which was mostly no. And with the grow operation, just hesitation. And I think it's because it's an unknown. We haven't talked about it, and there are just concerns. So the other questions I have are more about the whole state legal environment right now. I understand that the governor's made some comments, and there's some other laws that are they're planned for 2018, but they may be in flux right now. I was under the assumption that we were being limited for different uses similar to alcohol. In other words, if you are doing testing, you cannot do distribution and storefront, or like if you're doing, what was the other one? Well, testing, distribution limits your other things. How does that affect your business, given that you have three uses in one spot?
So great question, and I'll also have Daniel give kind of an update, because there are some good things going on today at the Capitol he can talk about as well. But just at a high level, how we've talked about with city staff of moving forward is, of course, we'll also have as a condition of approval compliance with whatever the state requirements are. So at this point, it actually looks like the state's going to allow the ability to have those co-located uses and have operations similar to what we're planning. So that's good news. So at least the development as it sits today is that looks like that will be allowed. Daniel can kind of give greater insight into that. But in any case, no matter, how it ultimately is approved, because none of us can completely read the crystal ball, we'll have a condition that requires us to comply with the state. So if the state were to pass a regulation that says you can't have manufacturing and cultivation in the same building, they're not going to do that, but just say that was the case, we would not be able to do both. We would have a business decision, we'd have to go back to the drawing board, figure out, okay, well, we just do manufacturing or we just do cultivation, and our project would be limited in that regard. So we'll have to be compliant with state law, wherever that ends up. But I think, and Daniel, maybe you want to talk about kind of what happened today at the Capitol with that.
Yes, thank you for that, and thank you again for the question. So as Jeff alluded to, today we saw a perfect example of the constantly evolving nature of this industry. As of 4 p.m. today, the State Senate and the State Assembly have passed budget trailer language that essentially reconciles the medical laws that were passed in 2015 with the recreational laws that were passed in 2016. And essentially, this was the culmination of a 6-month stakeholder process involving the industry, law enforcement, local government, and labor, just about everyone else, working through the best way to reconcile these two regulatory frameworks. The bottom line for us and for the matter at hand this evening is that, yes, essentially everything that we're contemplating will be allowable under state law. So the co-location, well, so first of all, you alluded to the kind of questions around cross-licensure and vertical integration. That was something that was more or less prohibited under the medical laws, but was allowed under Prop 64. While ultimately what was passed today went with the Prop 64 version, allowing basically unlimited cross-licensure, so you can operate basically as many licensed businesses across the supply chain as you can have permits for. Another question was about co-locating these different businesses and having them on the same premise. That was something else that was also, again, now permissible as of today. And then the third question, kind of related question, was, well, can you have medical and adult use facilities and licenses at the same location? And again, as of today, the answer is yes. So we've been fortunate in that we've been able to engage with state policymakers throughout this process, so that fortunately we've been telegraphing what we've been looking to do here in West Sacramento basically the whole time. So again, we wouldn't be here tonight if we weren't confident both in the city's ability to be a great partner and the state's willingness to allow projects like this to move forward.
Okay, thank you. David, just because there hasn't been a whole lot of time for us to actually research this between 4 p.m. and now, but prior to the next meeting, maybe we can have a brief overview of what actually happened at this state capitol today and what effect that does have on this.
Yeah, no, we'll absolutely want to be all over that, once that it comes out, and especially once, if the governor does indeed sign that. Fortunately, the League of Cities has been, doing a lot of work on this and helping, and I believe Mr. Conway's description of what is going on is generally the case. So we're definitely on this because we need to know what the rules are going to be also.
Okay. And then on a related note, our city has been relatively progressive, and there's a difference between our state laws and our federal laws, and there's currently some conflict of opinion between, say, the White House and our Congress, and it doesn't appear that Congress will be moving to make any changes as far as how they respond to medical cannabis use or recreational, but maybe just a high-level overview of what we're looking at for that.
So that's always been an issue. The position in the various states that have allowed either recreational or medical or both have been premised on a federal government position that was articulated by the previous administration to not pursue enforcement of federal marijuana laws except in certain circumstances like transportation across state line and use of federal lands illegally. There is always the possibility that direction could be reversed. The development agreement template that we're using allows either party to terminate the development agreement in the event that there is a determination by a state or federal authority that the activity is not permissible. So we have an out clause that we would anticipate using in the event that that happened. It's not something we would rush to, because we'd want to see how it unfolds. And, the system that we're operating in, the administration makes certain decisions. The U.S. attorneys have a discretion on how they're going to proceed. So there'd be a little period of time where we'd be trying to figure out exactly what is coming out of the current administration and the U.S. attorneys that would be relevant here. But we do have that that is something that we've contemplated, and we do have a provision that would allow us to get out of the and not just this with this particular development, but with the others as well.
And you guys would. You guys are always on top of it. So thank you so much for your presentation. And of course, they still probably have comments, but I look forward to seeing how this develops.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Booth.
Most of my questions have been asked and answered, so I'm glad everyone else did that for me first. But just a quick question for committee staff, or for the city staff. Now, this is only an overview or a workshop on the municipal code amendments. When do we expect their permit to come back to us for a vote?
I am right now anticipating that would be at one of your next, couple of meetings coming up on the calendar. I really want to have the benefit of also the council's discussion about this topic coming up as well to help inform on this. But we are continuing to try to move these projects forward, as has been our direction from the city manager's office.
Great. And just a general comment, thank you very much for coming here today and presenting your project. It's great to see that you guys decided to open here in West Sacramento and committed to hiring West Sacramentans to fill your job position. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. So I'll address some of my questions, and then I'll give Mr. Dorso a break and turn it over to discussion and comments from the commission. So again, I agree, most of my questions have been asked and answered. So just making more of a comment rather than a question, I had questions too about whether the business model would support not all three of the uses having a policy approval either by our city council or by the state. And it sounds like there's an interest in moving forward in this industry and pivoting the business model based on what is allowable and what is not allowable. And then the other question that I had was related to water as well. And this may be a question, but I believe, well, my question is, our urban ag community efforts have been impacted by water metering, and this is essentially indoor urban ag. And I just wanted, and I think I raised this concern with the applicant in a previous discussion, the question about, what the cost of water would mean, and, for example, would you come back and ask for a cost fee waiver? And I'm thinking, well, you chose to to do urban ag, but I think I'm pretty content with the answer that this is a low resource effort. So those are mostly my questions that have been addressed. So with that, you can take a seat. If questions come up, we can invite you up again. But I want to turn this over to some comment and discussion. So thank you very much to the applicants, and I'll start with Commissioner Lepore. Do you have?
Thank you. I actually did have one more
bearing in
question.
mind that this is a workshop, so if there's comments you would like to have for staff or for council as they make decisions on not just this application but cannabis policy, feel free to share that.
Okay, great. So I'm not sure who of the team would answer this, and it's more of I guess, sort of a business question, because a lot
You
of...
thought you had a break.
Brief break.
A lot of what I've been reading about in the cannabis industry recently, they've been comparing to wine in terms of growing grapes. So with the cultivation, is everything essentially estate grown, and meaning like everything that you're growing here would be also manufactured here, or would you be bringing in product grown somewhere else and then also manufactured here?
Turn it over to Ross.
Ross Haley again. It's actually, I could probably talk about this forever. I'm very passionate about this part. Very short, yes, guys. The answer would be is I view cannabis's future as very similar to wine. So an estate-grown vine turned into a really good wine, I think is going to be very similar to an estate-grown cannabis plant, either turned into a very high-quality oil or flower that's then marketed and sold for with the unique geographic tag to that plant. So most of what will come out of, in what our vision is today, out of this facility will be a very high-end quality, hopefully even organic is our intentions, medicinal cannabis, because it's such a controlled environment. We can really do a lot of fine tuning with the cultivation side in a facility like this. And just kind of with my experience of helping build out a lot of these facilities, including one in Nevada, which we've spoke about a little bit, we have even more experience to fine tune the build out of this facility to even be more accurate when it comes to these types of things. So the intent would be to grow and process it all within this building and use that material as a West Sacramento grown cannabis plants. I hope that answers your question.
About 90%. So then, would there be any product grown elsewhere and then brought here and then manufactured and then distributed out?
Yes,
Okay.
again, similar to wine, where not every grape grower has a winery.
Right.
Definitely intend to use this facility to process other cannabis into oils. So again, very similar to a winery as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, perfect. Thank you.
I have an additional question. Can someone address the issue of waste? I know this was asked at our previous, for a previous applicant, but given that there is cultivation, how are you handling the waste for this particular business? And then number two is the training that employees receive, or that employees will receive to be able to work at this facility. So the first question.
Yeah, first question on the waste. There's very stringent rules around cannabis waste in other jurisdictions already. We will follow the utmost safety. It's all about the safety of not only the employees, but of the residents in the community around us. We have the ability to completely satisfy any safety issues in regards to the waste with the waste product, both from a safety and a sustainability perspective. So many methods, but we will definitely be able to comply with any set standards. In fact, if you don't set one, our standards are going to be high enough to comply with anyone that will be out there anyway. So, in second question, sorry.
Just the training that employees receive to be able to work.
Yeah. Again, I have a lot of experience in running businesses with a lot of employees in safety and training, culture. All of these things are very important to our organization. So a lot of training and SOPs go into every facet of the business, from transportation to manufacturing to cultivation.
And same for you, can you spell out SOP?
Oh, sorry. Standard operating procedures. So yes, again, standards of high level for these types of facilities is extremely important to not only the community, but us, our business too.
Well, before I move on, and you can have a seat, I think you can have a seat, but does Commissioner Lepore or Commissioner Castillo, do you have any other comments that you'd like to go on record or anything? Okay, great. Vice Chair Sternfels.
Thank you, Chair. A few comments. First, I wanted to take a moment to thank staff. Between our last meeting and this one, I sat down with both Director Hamilton and Mr. Tilley and had kind of a broader conversation about where we're going with the policy direction. A lot of that was shared tonight, so I want to thank you guys for A, taking the time to do that, and B, taking a moment to report on that tonight. I think it's helpful for the commission to kind of know where things are headed. In terms of this project in particular, I think there are some I don't want to say concerns in a strong way, but certainly in having multiple uses under one roof. So I think I've heard some of that, particularly on the cultivation side, from Commissioner Liebig, that I just kind of want to point out, like, if that is going to be the state of the land with the new law, it's perceivable that we could have an applicant with 4 or 5 or 6 different uses under one location. And so from policy perspectives, some of the things I'd like council to particularly look at is, okay, well, how far do we want to go? Do we want to allow someone with 5 or 6 uses that we're all approving, in a future zoning amendment to be under one roof or not, and what are the pros and cons of that? What are the kind of different levels of risk associated with that? The other thing, and I'm really glad that Commissioner Lepore brought this up on kind of the West Sac grown. I have to say, I think part of the reason we've taken the approach we have in focusing on kind of the less visible areas of this industry is because we're okay to step in the waters, but we don't want to be too visible or vocal or have the whole world know about it necessarily. And so I would say another policy call that I would hope there's some discussion on is whether or not we're comfortable with folks marketing, if we're growing here, that it's grown here or that it's manufactured here on their labels of their products. And I'm not sure we have actually any role in deciding that, because we may not, maybe state law trumps that, but to the extent we at least have that policy conversation and discussion about what that means and how we feel about it, I think that's a really important kind of perception and image of our community that, I don't want it to take away from the broader conversation, but it's a new kind of thread that we haven't talked about before, and I think it warrants some additional discussion. Three on the bigger picture. So I want to echo Commissioner Liebig's point about the zoning. The first project that we approved was actually in the M1 zone. The project we heard last time was in the ML zone, and now we have a project in the M2 zone. I totally understand the comments by Ms. Hamilton regarding the council's kind of direction to look at the whole swath of the M zones, but I have some concerns with that. There's certain parts of the M zones I think should be off limits, and I worry about geographical spread across our town of this industry. I think we need to focus on a couple areas where it makes sense. I do have some concerns that we've had an applicant come before us now who's purchased a property without us kind of considering and having real clear guidance on where we want to go from a zoning perspective, because that kind of holds our feet to the fire a little bit. So my very strong preference would be that before we moved forward on either of these applicants, that we got the clarity we needed on kind of the broader policy framework. And I appreciate the direction that's been given by the council to the city manager on moving forward with these applications as they come. But now we have one approved, two in the last two meetings, and we know one more is there. That's four businesses in the city we're talking about, and we don't have a clear approved framework or something in front of us where we can know exactly where these businesses can and can't go, and what uses are compatible together, and what uses maybe shouldn't be, or what license types maybe should be and shouldn't be. And so I look forward to council having that conversation, and I just want, and I'm also, maybe to debunk a myth, I'm not opposed to approving these applicants as they come before us, but my big stick is going to be having a policy framework that we can all work within and understand, and that makes clear sense, and that's been fully vetted before I make those decisions. And so if this item does come back before us, or the one previously, without us having a broader framework approved or at least sent to council for consideration, I'm going to have strong reservations voting in favor of it. Not because of the professionalism of the applicant, I want to make that very clear. You guys did a great presentation, a great job tonight. But from a policy perspective, we have got to figure this out before we keep making one-off decisions about who can go where. And not, again, this is no reflection of this individual applicant or the one the previous week, but a necessity for us, once we've opened the box of allowing this use in our city, which we did with the first project, to wrap it up and say, okay, here's the parameters, here's what you can do, where and when. And I realize I'll stop in a second, I promise. But I realize there's a broader, a shifting conversation. Things are constantly moving. We have state policy changing every day. But I think we're at a place now where we can kind of put a framework around what we want to allow where and what it should look like and what some of the parameters need to be. And I think city's done a great job of vetting applicants and bringing them to us. But from a land use perspective, which is the jurisdiction of this body, we've got to figure out that piece. And I know we're getting there, and I'm grateful for the good work that's going to hopefully get us there. But it's still very hard for me to know how I feel about this until I can come to terms with what the broader framework and policy is going to be. So with that, again, thank you, city staff, thank the applicant for a very nice presentation tonight, and that'll end my comments.
Sure, yeah, Commissioner Vu.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for the applicants. It was mentioned about standards on dealing with waste that you guys are following. These are, according to your words, very stringent standards. What are these standards? Who had set these standards that you guys are following? Is it industry association standards, state laws, local ordinances, and No, I mean, my concern is, no, how do we, no, you guys might follow these standards, but as part of the broader policy question, how do we hold others that follow you to the same standards if they're not under state law or city ordinance?
So two things, and I'm going to do a total politician move and back in to answer one of his questions, answering your question. So what you're going to, which is really kind of one of the approaches that I think the city's used, which is great, is, for each of these uses in a zone, a CUP is required. So in terms of a lot of the questions in terms of location within a zone, appropriateness in a particular neighborhood, this body and ultimately the city council will have the right to reject or accept projects on a case-by-case basis. So as a land use attorney, and of course I'm representing applicants, but I always encourage bodies to keep flexibility on those decisions, because when you have too many location determinations within a zone, you start having impacts that none of us can see everything. So by having a CUP process, you allow yourself to maintain the flexibility while still, disapproving maybe locations that are inappropriate or otherwise. With that, kind of on your question, those standards typically are, municipal standards. At this point in this industry, generally either by county or by city, they have those standards in place. The other tool that we have and that the city's directed applicant to use is the development agreement. And that's a great tool in terms of memorializing what those requirements might be. And I think kind of as a homework assignment for our team, we can go back and maybe even working with city staff, kind of come up with what we think best practices are on some of those things and look at either establishing those as conditions or putting them in our project so there's some teeth to assume that. Yeah.
Sorry. Commissioner, also, I thank you, Jeff, for that, and just specifically in terms of how to deal with waste in situations like this. As you was alluded to, there's a number of different ways you can do this, both looking at other states with licensed marijuana industries, but also, frankly, other industrial and manufacturing uses. So it's everything from incinerating your waste to grinding it until it's unusable to mixing it with other waste that therefore makes it, unappealing to anyone who might want it. So the point is there's a lot of, very uninteresting ways to deal with this interesting byproduct of this process. So ultimately, to Jeff's point, this might be something you guys want to codify as part of the city's process, but for us as operators, it's really just a matter of picking one of the existing practices and using it. So, thank you.
So there's nothing,
I guess the point is we can codify that now in a development agreement to hold ourselves accountable to what that is. So we can work with city staff and come up with what we think, is the best practice, basically subject to what the city staff ultimately kind of recommends, and then include that in our approval when we come back to you.
so there's nothing currently existing in state law, either the 2015 amendments or 2016 law or under the new, hopefully to be signed budget?
Probably ultimately there will be, but not sitting here today, and I think our assumption is this will be approved before that's finalized. So I think, certainly the applicant's willing, and I assume city staff and the city will probably want some teeth to have a standard there, which again, will have a general condition that says we also have to comply with state law. So if the state has some, a more stringent standard, we would then have to comply with that more stringent standard.
I think then it would, as part of the broader policy discussion, that perhaps some city ordinance or, somehow look at standards for dealing with waste or even wastewater or anything along those lines.
So we're not starting from scratch there. With all of our commercial businesses, industrial businesses, we do have a waste and recycling ordinance, and there are regulations. And that even starts with construction on their tenant improvements, but will also go into operations. So that's a minimum base level, but obviously there will probably be more product-specific with respect to the cultivation or some of the other manufactured products that I think will come out from the state. There has been some discussion on cultivation and from an environmental perspective. So I think also going through the CEQA process is also going to inform some mitigations and some probably conditions.
Commissioner Ruwa, you have the floor. Do you have anything else? And no other questions or comments? Okay, great. Commissioner Liebig.
No further comments. Thank you.
You have no further comments? You sure?
I'm sure.
All right, so I'll share with staff my comments. So I'll reiterate what I said at our last meeting, where my preference would be to get some direction from the council on policy, and then look at zoning collectively, and then in a subsequent meeting, that would be my preference, entertain the specific applications for their use permits and DAs, their development agreements at a subsequent meeting. So I am talking about 3 separate meetings, but I do think that that's actually really good policy and gives us an opportunity, first of all, for applicants to be able to react and respond to any zoning amendments that we might make, as well as give an opportunity for really a public input and noticing after a policy has been officially set. So that being said, I want to comment a little bit about that. As far as requests or directions for council as they move towards forming some policy on cannabis as it relates to land use, I'm personally very much in favor of this. I think this is a really great opportunity for innovation, job growth, and high-quality jobs, as well as it's really, for me, part of the West Sacramento Ag Tech, and I think that that's a really great opportunity. That being said, this is my opinion, and I think that my opinion will be secondary to what is in the best policy interest of our city, and I really leave that to the council, who weighs a lot of other things that we on the Planning Commission do not weigh. Regarding the zoning, it's really important to me that we take things together. And so I've heard that echoed by a couple of commissioners, and I would like there to be a strategic and thoughtful way to making a zoning amendment. So whether that's all the M district or just a certain, this one or that one, I don't want there to be sort of a one-off where any applicant can come forward and make a request. I think it's much better to have a strategic policy, and I would like staff to provide some direction to Vice Chair Sturmfield's point about allowing certain zoning, but there may be restrictions such as, whether it's within X number of feet of, a healthcare facility or school. I mean, I'm just making something up, but there may be some other considerations that there might be precedent for that we might want to entertain. So I would look to staff to provide any information that they may have, for example, from the League of Cities or from other colleagues around this state or other states, on ways that we could approach that. And then the third I'd like to address is the issue of use permits. Again, so the use permits for our particular applicants, one of which is here tonight. But I my opinion is that I don't want to put into code and put into zoning amendments very stringent rules. I think that is the role of having conditional use permits, that project by project, we approve, okay, well, these are some of the unique safety concerns. These are some of our unique, development agreement concerns. They will vary by applicant. They will vary by location. So I would hesitate towards making general statements like that. That's another reason why I want us to make a relatively simple and straightforward zoning amendment change, if we make a change at all, and that it will be applicant by applicant where we can make some of these unique issues that have been raised, whether it's about waste or signage or public safety or water use, et cetera. And so those are some of my comments as we move forward. And before I close this item, I want to just look to my left and right and see if anyone else has anything else that they'd like to add or ask. Great. Staff, thank you very much. Applicants, thank you very much for coming out and spending so much time with us. And that is the conclusion of item 5. And as the applicants for item 5 are making their way out, we will call forward for item 4, which is a public workshop on the Yolo Habitat Conservancy, on the public review draft Yolo Habitat Conservation Plan, Natural Community Conservation Plan, and public review draft EIR and EIS. And is that Ms. Hamilton? Great.
Yes, I will provide an introduction on this item. So this is a major milestone tonight, or actually this month, we have the public review draft of both the plan and the EIR EIS out on the street for public comment during the 90-day period. I will remind the commission that the city is a permittee under this plan, so we have been participating the whole way since pretty much 2002. And so this did go to the Environment and Utilities Commission on Monday night, and they provided comments and review related from an environmental and natural resource perspective, which is in their purview. Tonight, this is before you again to receive public comment and provide opportunities for our citizens to speak on this, should they choose to. But tonight, for you, it's more from the land development mitigation perspective. Because if this permit is issued, which we anticipate it will be in 2018, then as projects come forward to you, they will be pointing to this plan and this permit that we have with respect to their mitigation for any potential takes on the covered species. So with that, Petrea Marchand with the YOLO Habitat Conservancy is here this evening and has a PowerPoint that's going to go over the plan and the EIR EIS. And she also is accompanied by her other staff and Sean Bechta with Ascent Environmental for any of the environmental questions. So with that, I'll turn it back to the chair and to Petrea.
Thank you, Chair Austin, members of the commission. As Director Hamilton said, I'm Petrea Marchand. I'm the Executive Director of the YOLO Habitat Conservancy. The YOLO Habitat Conservancy, as you may know, is a joint powers agency formed in 2002. It consists of all 4 cities and the county of YOLO. It also has UC Davis as an ex officio member. So just as a little background, because I know this process has been going on for a long time, but we still get a lot of questions about what a habitat conservation plan and a natural conservation, community conservation plan actually is. A habitat conservation plan is a permit granted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to local permittees, in this case, as Director Hamilton said, the city of West Sacramento, the other 3 cities in the county of YOLO, as well as the Habitat Conservancy, under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act, and it covers all federal mitigation associated with infrastructure and development activities in the city and county general plans. So a natural community conservation plan is the equivalent of that permit on the state level, and that permit is issued under the California Endangered Species Act and is issued by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. In return for these permits, the member agencies, not just the Conservancy, but all 4 cities in the county, commit to a conservation strategy based on biological criteria to mitigate for the effects of those covered activities. So it replaces the existing project-by-project, species-by-species approach to mitigation for endangered species with a coordinated regional approach that is run by the YOLO Habitat Conservancy. And the primary benefits of the permit and why we've worked so hard and spent so much money over the years to secure this permit is that it provides local control over the permitting process. So no longer do applicants have to seek permits from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They come to the YOLO Habitat Conservancy, which has elected officials from each of the jurisdictions on their board of directors. The second is that it improves and increases species conservation. As part of the Natural Community Conservation Plan, we actually have to conserve habitat above mitigation, and we use state and federal grants and some local matching funds to do that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And we're also identifying the areas in the county that the species will most benefit, so you have increased and improved species conservation. And the third is streamlined project permitting. In the other Northern California counties that have similar permits, Endangered Species Act permitting is taking around 2 months to complete. You submit an application and you're done. So after evaluation and application of avoidance and minimization measures. So it's a lot more stability as well as streamlining of the process. The plan area is the entire county of YOLO. We cover all of the roads, bridges, unincorporated communities, as well as the cities, anything that's in the general plans. This is the location of those covered activities, about 19,000 acres over the course of the 50-year permit. And as I mentioned, in return for coverage for those 19,000 acres, we will be conserving habitat in the areas shown with the green arrow. That's primarily the Yolo Bypass, Pewta Creek, Cache Creek, and then we'll also be preserving farmland between the cities for foraging habitat for raptors like Swainson's hawk and white-tailed kite. These are the 12 species that we cover. I'm sure that you've encountered them all in one way or another. The ones that are we find to have the most issues with mitigation in Yolo County are the burrowing owl, Swainson's hawk, the elderberry beetle, and the giant garter snake. And we have also, there's some issues with mitigation in the Dunnigan Hills for the tiger salamander. But we cover all 12 of these species under our plan. And so instead of the, paying a Swainson's hawk fee here or going to a giant garter snake mitigation bank over here, you get the permit covers all 12 species for one fee. As I mentioned, it covers a total of 19,000 acres. Those are broken out into a number of different land use categories: urban, rural infrastructure, and agricultural economic development open space. So we're also permitting habitat restoration activities. And we also are permitting what we call non-spatially defined activities, like operation and maintenance of associated with canals and levees. And although a number of, reclamation districts and water districts have said they don't necessarily need this type of coverage, it is a 50-year permit, so we wanted to make sure that if there was ever any Endangered Species Act permitting needs over the 50 years, that we were in a position to help water districts and reclamation districts with that permit coverage. Fees are always a question that people have a lot of interest in. As you know, there's existing fees that are currently paid by applicants for species mitigation. We are replacing that with one fee that covers all 12 species. The fee is based on our costs of acquiring agricultural conservation easements primarily, but other costs associated with implementing our conservation strategy. And that base fee is $11,231 per acre. If the project impacts wetlands environment, so either valley, foothill, riparian, fresh emergent wetlands, or lacustrine and riverine, since there is a restoration requirement, which is more expensive, the fee is in the $49,000 to $62,000 range. This is an example of a graphical description of the existing process with which I know you as commissioners are familiar. The development application is submitted to the local planning department. Both the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have to approve the mitigation, the location of it, and how much. And often that results in a need to coordinate in circles with the three agencies until you reach agreement, until finally you get out of that circle, mitigate for your project, and get your permit. And sometimes that can go quickly, and sometimes it can take a much longer period of time. With the HCP, NCCP, it's a regional approach. You start with a development application. It goes through the planning department like an applicant normally would. The local planning department reviews for consistency with the plan. The developer pays a fee, and then the conservancy is responsible for all of the mitigation. The applicant is not responsible for going out and finding an easement, purchasing a credit from a mitigation bank, or any of that other work, because the regulatory agencies have essentially pre-approved all of that conservation through this plan. And that's why it takes such a long time to get these plans done, is because getting pre-approval from regulatory agencies is not the easiest thing to do. This is a comparison of the benefits under the existing approach and the regional approach. So typical project-by-project approaches, they find a Swainson's hawk easement here or a giant garter snake credit here, and generally it means that you have smaller parcels and they're spread out and not coordinated. When you have a regional approach, you can buy larger tracts of land. You can focus all of your purchase of easements or your restoration efforts in certain areas, and so you end up with more connected and larger parcels, which is better for the species. Over the course of 50 years, the Conservancy will be conserving 33,000 acres. The majority of this conservation is the acquisition of habitat conservation easements on agricultural land. We are a new and model conservation plan in that respect. The majority of other plans purchase rangeland or other land in fee title, and we are going to be working with farmers and really building on Yolo County's history in wildlife-friendly farming to acquire easements on working landscapes. The agencies did recognize how much conservation has already occurred in Yolo County. We have about 90,000 acres that are already protected. And so they allowed us to count 8,000 acres that are already protected towards our permit requirements. And that is, I think, once this is permitted, we're going to be even more grateful than we are now for that 8,000 acres, because it's a huge savings for all of the permittees who are sharing the costs. So as a result of that, we only need to conserve about 24,000 acres of new lands, again, mostly in easements. 16,000 of those acres are mitigation for the impacts from development, and about 8,000 is the conservation beyond mitigation that I spoke about earlier. That's part of the Natural Community Conservation Plan requirement, and that's primarily going to be paid for with state and federal grants and local match. We also have about 1,000 acres of wetlands that we'll be restoring over the course of 50 years as well, but as you can tell, the main focus is going to be on that agricultural land conservation and wildlife-friendly farming. The total cost of the plan over 50 years is $371 million, because we're taking all of the costs that everybody's incurring right now on a case-by-case basis and rolling it up all into one big program. About 48% of those costs are for acquisition of easements for mitigation. About 36% is acquisition of easements for conservation above mitigation, and the remaining 16% is for that wetland restoration that I spoke about earlier. Funding from the plan, one of the permit findings is that you must demonstrate, you can't just say I'm going to find the money somewhere somehow, you have to actually demonstrate where that money is going to come from. So we have about 64% of the funding for the plan is coming from mitigation fees that will be paid for by public agencies and from private developers. Federal and state funding, that's grant funding, is about 21%, and there are dedicated grant programs for these types of programs and habitat conservation easements, so we anticipate that there will be more money available to the county for habitat conservation than there was prior to this program occurring. We have a local match of about 12%, and that local match is from the City of Davis's open space tax, the Solano County Water Agency's program to restore Pewter Creek, and Yolo County's efforts with the gravel companies to restore Cache Creek. So those three programs will not change as a result of our plan, but we will be working with them as partners to develop projects and share the costs of projects that we mutually have the same objectives for. And then we have a small amount of money from investment interest. There are, because the City of West Sacramento is a permittee, we do have member agency actions. Once this public comment period is over, we incorporate public comments. We'll be coming back to you and to the City Council for these actions. So this is the first step in a long process. You'll see me again. So you have to consider the EIS-EIR, make the CEQA findings, approve the plan, approve an implementing ordinance, because you'll be collecting the fees and then transferring them to the Conservancy, and approving and executing the implementing agreement, and finally the CEQA notice of determination. So this is just your early heads up that we'll be back if we're successful in putting together the final. And I'll be turning it over to Sean Beckta with Ascent Environmental to talk about the EIS-EIR next, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview of where we are in the process. We did start this JPA in 2002. The JPA in 2002 replaced a previous HCP effort in the 90s that was unsuccessful. So this is really the culmination of a very long process. I estimate that when I took over in about 2012, we were about 20% done with the plan. We're now about 95% done, and I do anticipate that if all goes well, the permits will be issued by the wildlife agencies by the end of 2018, if not sooner. So we will be the comment period ends August 30th. We'll spend the fall incorporating public comments, coming back to you for those member agency actions. We'll then submit the final plan, and then it will really just be up to the agencies how long it will take them to issue the permits. But we expect to actually submit the plan to them by the end of 2017 or early 2018. So with that, I will turn it over to Sean Beckta for a brief overview of the EIS-EIR.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioners. Again, my name is Sean Beckta with Ascent Environmental. We are contracted by the Conservancy to prepare the EIS-EIR for the HCP and CCP. We're working under a third-party contract with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so we are representing them under NEPA, preparing the document to comply with their environmental review law while concurrently preparing it for the Conservancy as the CEQA lead agency at this time to comply with CEQA. This presentation was prepared with the idea of incorporating incorporating it into the public review process for the draft EIS-CIR. So it is prepared in the context of having the public view it and potentially provide comments. So there may be some elements of this that are very familiar to you that are intended for the public and not the commission itself. So the intent is to provide an overview of the draft EIS-CIR and to receive public comments. Where, as Petrea is going and providing information on the HCP and CCP itself, the draft was released the same time as the EIS-CIR, so we are tagging along with that as this opportunity to gather input and comments on the EIS-CIR. So pointing out that this is both a document, the EIS-CIR, covering the National Environmental Policy Act for Fish and Wildlife Service and CEQA, great deal of similarities between the two laws. They're actually written at the same time by some of the same people, shuttling between California and Washington, D.C. And so the role of the EIS-CIR is very similar to what I'm sure you're aware of for just a straight EIR, evaluate the impacts, inform the public of the decision makers of those impacts, identify mitigation measures to reduce or minimize significant adverse effects, look at alternatives, and also provide a venue to engage the public and seek comments. Wanted to point out the relationship between the Endangered Species Act and NEPA. So the Endangered Species Act incidental take permit is the action by Fish and Wildlife Service that is triggering NEPA. So from their perspective, they are issuing a permit to the applicants, being in this case the Conservancy and the Conservancy members. Issuing that permit triggers their environmental review. So that's what brings in NEPA. The Endangered Species Act permit, the service wants to be clear, is separate from the NEPA review process, two different items. Their main interest is whether or not to issue that permit, and then they do the environmental review to disclose the environmental effects of that action. And then for the California Endangered Species Act is a very similar relationship between the California Endangered Species Act authorization and CDFW using the EIR ultimately as a responsible agency. So the process, we had the trigger for the EIS-CIR. There was a notice of information under NEPA, notice of preparation under CEQA and scoping. We're in the draft EIS-CIR review stage. As Petrea said, there'll be a final document, and then ultimately the agency decision by the Conservancy, and then returning to the member agencies to acting as responsible agencies under CEQA. So the contents of the EIS-CIR is very similar to what you'd see in an EIR, introduction, executive summary, description of the action and alternatives, the environmental analysis. This being such a broad geographic area with a lot of different activities, this is considered a programmatic level of analysis. And then the other sections that would be typical of CEQA, growth-inducing effects, and also some NEPA requirements such as consistency with executive orders. So if you happen to look through the EIS-CIR, if you're not familiar with the joint documents, you'll see some things that are required under NEPA that would not necessarily be in a straight EIR. So we had looked at the no action alternative, which is a summary of the impacts if there's no HCP, NCCP. So this is a little different from a project level document in that we're really looking at the effects of a different permitting program. So right now, applicants can comply with the Endangered Species Act. There's a process to do that. They go individually to Fish and Wildlife Service and CDFW for the California Endangered Species Act and get their permits. We're evaluating the effects of a different permitting process to get Endangered Species Act compliance. The Fish and Wildlife Service and CDFW are providing authority to the Conservancy and the member agencies to act in their stead. And if a project comes in and meets the necessary requirements, then the Endangered Endangered Species Act authorization can be provided. So as far as development goes, really the development is the same development scenario under either with the HCP or without the HCP. The differences are in the implementation of the HCP, which is what the EIS-EIR focuses on. So what's different when the Conservancy provides the mitigation, takes those fees, and sets up that conservation strategy as opposed to individual project applicants doing it on a project-by-project basis. So the key differences we looked at were the establishment of the overall reserve system rather than individual reserves operated by multiple entities, the management and activities on the reserve system, fences, monitoring, everything that's required to make sure that the reserve system is performing as Fish and Wildlife Service and CDFW require, public access and recreation in the reserve system, habitat enhancement, restoration, creation, so there's some elements of taking existing lands and converting them to another habitat type, species surveys, monitoring and research, agricultural activity on the reserve system, so many of the reserves are going to be conservation easements on ag land, and there may be some modifications there that we evaluated, and then the neighboring landowner protection program, which is an element of the plan related to the idea that if a landowner has a preserve created right next to them, there's a higher probability of an endangered species coming onto their land, and a way to be able to address that in the favor of that particular landowner. Typical issue areas were evaluated in the EIS-EIR. The one specific to NEPA is socioeconomics and environmental justice, but the rest are pretty typical of CEQA documents. We had two areas where we had significant impacts: land use and agricultural and forestry resources. The land use, the nature of the impact is there's some overlap between the YOLO HCP, NCCP, and the Solano HCP that's being prepared. The Solano HCP is primarily related to irrigation districts and water infrastructure. Some of that infrastructure comes into Yolo County, and so some of their covered activities, such as clearing out culverts, clearing out canals, are in areas that overlap with the Yolo HCP. CEQA, the initial study checklist, asks us, does the activity conflict with another HCP? We took a very conservative approach and said, because they overlap, there is that potential. The mitigation is pretty easy. Make sure that the Conservancy coordinates with the Solano folks to make sure that there's not a conflict. And so that's reduced to a less than significant level. For agricultural impacts, as I said, there are some elements of habitat restoration or creation. So there's about 702 acres projected of habitat creation on what is currently agricultural land, and then conversion up to 210 acres of grassland to another habitat type. We took a conservative approach and said all of that might be grazing land that we might consider agricultural land. So although the plan itself would result in permanent protection of more than 21,000 acres of agricultural and grazing land. Because there's that 702 and 210 acres of potential conversion, there's not a way to recreate that land. It's going to be converted to another non-agricultural habitat type that'll have a legal obligation to be retained in that habitat in perpetuity. We call that a significant and unavoidable impact. We looked at three alternatives. One, the no-action alternative, as I said, a continuation of existing conditions. Reduced take alternative, so that one, there was about 1,335 acres in different locations throughout the plan area, some in the city, some in the county, where we created an alternative that said, what if you did not allow take in those areas to minimize the effects on species? Other things could happen in those locations, but the alternative looked at the idea that nothing that would happen that would cover take. That was a request from the service to look at something that minimizes effects. And then a reduced development alternative looked at two areas totaling 1,395 acres that said the planned land use could still occur, but it would not be covered within the plan. So an idea of you would have less area covered under the HCP. In comparison of the alternatives, all of the action alternatives resulted in beneficial effects relative to the no action. So as Petrea said, this is a difficult endeavor for everyone involved, a costly endeavor. No one will go into it without benefits from all sides. And so from the services side, there's benefits to species, from other aspects, other benefits. So all the action alternatives result in a superior outcome based on our analysis. In the action alternatives, there's some gradients and differences of impact. There's no change or from significant to less than significant, same number of significant impacts, same mitigation requirements. But for the reduced take alternative, the way the alternative was created, it said less take but the same conservation area. So less, from a biological perspective, less negative effect but the same benefit. So that came out as the superior alternative, but there's some questions about the financial feasibility of doing that, because if you have less development or less take, then you have less fees coming in, but with the same obligation for conservation. So we're in the public review process. As we went through before the process, the draft EIR is prepared. We're going through public review, EIS, EIR, there'll be a final, and then the record of decision by the Conservancy, and then getting through that process, then returning to the member agencies. And I'm going to turn it back over to Petrea to talk about the public review process.
This is our last slide, so thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. I know it's late. In case anybody from the public is listening, we are really anxious to hear from individuals who have comments on our plan. So we are accepting comments through August 30th. We're accepting them orally, in writing, all the typical ways. You can email us. The most important point I think I wanted to make is that we do have a court reporter at 3 meetings that are coming up, June 19th, and June 27th and June 29th. So if people would like their comments recorded verbatim, there will be a court reporter at those 3 meetings so that they can have their thoughts in the record. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your presentation this evening. I'll start to my left with Commissioner Liebig with any comments or questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Marchand. I particularly appreciate the acknowledgement of the value of ag land in this HCP. I would have personally liked to see some inclusion of, say, fish species, but I do understand the difficulty with adding species at this point. In fact, especially given the recent cutting of several species, but there's been a lot of work in the bypass areas or along there with habitat use of, say, rice fields, flooded rice fields. And this city in particular has a lot of waterfront, of which some of the other areas don't. So I could see that being a reason for why fish species don't get included. But as we're working on levees, we're dealing with multiple species or listed species for the levee project, for example, or anytime we work in the port. But one question I have is for the covered area, am I interpreting this correct? The covered area for this HCP is less than 3% of Yolo County?
The 19,000 acres?
Yeah.
Covered, yeah, that's the area of impact. So yeah, those are the activities in the general plans. And we went through a process working with GIS specialists in each of the cities to determine where exactly the development will be. The plan area is the entire county because there's roads and levees and other things that are in the unincorporated area. But Yolo County's development, unlike many other counties, is very compact. And relative to other counties, and maybe this is your point, we do have a relatively small amount of impact compared to other counties. There's a relatively small amount of planned development relative to other counties.
Okay, so, but it does cover the entire county?
Yeah, activities in the entire county are covered by our permit, but the orange map that you saw, or the map that showed the orange areas, and I can go back to it really quickly in the beginning. That orange there, that is the actual planned development in the city and county general plans.
Gotcha. So, for example, on the north side of West Sacramento, which is not orange, say they wanted to do tear down a development and build something else, that is also covered under this plan.
Yeah, and I would actually defer to my land use experts. Oh, Charlene, on this one.
So that's considered existing developed land. So it wouldn't trigger CEQA in this case. So when it's already developed and it's not habitat to begin with.
Under the city's infill CEQA.
Yeah.
we still evaluate it for CEQA, but,
Yes.
but it's not a new development. Okay.
I kind of summarized that, but the areas that are shown in orange are the areas that fall within a land cover type that's likely to have habitat of these 12 species, and that is likely not developed or is underdeveloped.
Okay. I think Ms. Marchand answered my question, though, that the rest of the areas would be covered if there was a need.
Oh, and actually, an important point, too, is that you're not locked to this footprint. Our take permit is based on the natural community's impact, the number of acres of natural community's impact. So let's say West Sacramento decided to grow in a different place, but the type of land that it was impacting was the same, say agricultural land. You could use your permit coverage in that other area as long as it was the same natural community. So this is just giving you a brief glimpse of what's in your general plans right now, but it's a 50-year permit, and if you change your general plan, as long as it's consistent, the impacts are consistent with what we evaluated, you will be able to change the location of that development.
How does the fees structure for this affect the fees structure for our city? I can give an example. One comes to mind. If a development wants to remove a heritage oak tree, there's a fee that the city charges to mitigate that. Is that different? Or
Yes, that's covered by a different ordinance.
and that doesn't change under this?
That does not change.
Okay.
The Swainson's hawk fee would no longer be paid independent, though. So the Swainson's hawk is one of our covered species. You wouldn't see someone paying our fee and a Swainson's hawk fee. It's all a part of the one.
Okay,
fee.
and that's just because the oak isn't included in this.
Right,
part.
that's exactly
Swanson
right.
oak is.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Vu.
Question just popped into my head. In one of the topics that we voted on as part of the consent agenda, I think it was for the adult community, there was some concern about habitat for some of the hawks and the kites. And how does that mesh with this plan?
So even now, with development, and actually for the last couple of years since the GIS land cover types were developed by the Conservancy, we've been using their land cover type model. So with every project that has come forward over the last couple of years, we look at the project site and see what the Conservancy has for a land cover type. And we actually, if there's any confusion on it, we call them and talk to them about it and determine whether or not this actually the project site would qualify as habitat. And I believe on that one, it did not. It wasn't identified as a land cover type that supported foraging habitat.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. How about Vice Chair, we'll start with Commissioner Lepore.
I first just want to thank you for your work. It's, with climate change and everything that we deal with in our community environments, it's really important work, so thank you. One question I had was on the chart, on the attachment, just going through with the covered species, with the first draft starting at 32 and ending up at 12. How did you determine, like, who stays and who goes, and
So
what that process was like?
we based it primarily on the needs of the member agencies for mitigation. The plan does commit you to mitigation regardless of whether you use your take coverage. And the board of directors was very concerned about the cost of the plan for that second draft. It was at about $500 million. So we looked very carefully at each of the species, and we eliminated the ones that were not listed as endangered or threatened. They were on the list originally because there was some potential during the 50 years for them to become listed, and we worked with the agencies to identify the ones that seemed very unlikely to ever be listed. And that reduced their conservation obligation and reduced the cost of the plan.
Thanks for that very thorough presentation. Appreciate the info. I just have one question on the funding. I know you stated that 12% of the funding, which is about $45 million, will come from local jurisdictions. How is that formally determined? So for example, West Sacramento versus Davis or Woodland?
Right. West Sacramento, this is where you get to say thank you to Davis and the county and to the Solano County Water Agency outside of our county, because they just happen to have open space programs with similar objectives. So we approached them and said, we think we can partner if you're willing to, in the case of the Board of Supervisors, pass a resolution that says we're willing to partner with you and identify matching funds over the course of 50 years, then we'll help you implement your program. So it works both ways. They're going to put their local matching funds towards projects that meet our permit requirements, and we're going to pay for a portion of the cost of implementing their open space program. So it's really a perfect example of some of these early conservation programs being rewarded for the work that they've done, because they're already in existence, they're not going to change their priorities, and we're going to come in and help to supplement and grow some of the activities that they're already doing. It does not mean that West Sacramento or Winters or Woodland have to put in money. Those jurisdictions that have open space programs, their programs will benefit, and then the other member agencies that don't have those programs will benefit because they receive the permit coverage.
So is there a maximum amount of money that each jurisdiction can get as it relates to funding certain projects?
We actually...
One more than the other, for example?
That's going to be determined on a case-by-case basis as funding becomes available, because we don't know yet, which grant programs will fund, maybe there's going to be a special emphasis on Pewter Creek next year. So we're going to be looking at it on a case-by-case basis. But I will tell you that the amount that they're putting in locally is different. The City of Davis is the lowest, the Solano County Water Agency is second, and the County of Yolo, with its gravel program to restore Cache Creek, or its partnership with the gravel companies to restore Cache Creek, is definitely the biggest contributor to those local matching funds.
Thanks.
Thank you. Vice Chair Sturmfels.
I'll be brief. Thank you. I know this has been in the works for a very long time, and while most of the presentation is focused on kind of the values associated with conservation and mitigation, habitat restoration, there's something else really important that comes with this plan, and that's consistency and really clarity and process and fee structure for developing our community, which I can't say how valuable that is in terms of keeping us kind of on the forefront as a place that folks look to continue to grow and either grow their business or to develop. So, while I certainly value the conservation, mitigation, habitat restoration, the huge benefit of this plan is that we are all working under the same umbrella, and we've got very clear rules of the road on how we're going to handle certain species and what it's going to look like, and we don't have to go through this rigmarole project by project, applicant by applicant on figuring out, is it there, is it not there, how many times have we seen it, how are we going to deal with it, how much is it going to cost to mitigate for it, where's that money going to go, and setting up all those agreements. We've created a package deal, and there is a tremendous amount of value in that. So I can't wait for you guys to bring this back and be a part of bringing this to the finish line. Thank you and city staff and the other communities involved too for all the hard work going into it.
Great, thank you. And I want to echo Vice Chair Sturmfeld's comments as well. I think that this is one of those win-win situations, right? So this type of plan really has significant benefit for the environment as well as the business and development communities. It's a great win-win for the reasons that Vice Chair Sturmfeld's indicated. And I also think that it's important for us to note that West Sacramento as a city will be both a big contributor and a big beneficiary of this particular program. And I think that this type of plan will help promote the type of infill development that we would like within our city limits, and really preserves and protects a lot of the beautiful kind of natural and agricultural lands directly abutting our city limits. And with that, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what, if you have ideas of the types or specific properties that are in and near West Sacramento that would be the kind of areas that would be eligible for conservation.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have a waiting list of landowners who are just waiting for us to be complete and have the resources to purchase agricultural conservation easements. That was a priority of mine as executive director, was to make sure if I was going to recommend this plan to the member agencies that there were willing landowners willing to sell easements so that we could be successful. So we early on decided to develop a waiting list, and we're surprised, given we haven't advertised that extensively, by how many people are interested. We have had, especially between West Sacramento and Clarksburg, we've had some interest by landowners who are on Babel Slough or near the Sacramento River. Those are really valuable properties. They provide a lot of hawk habitat, and there's also the riparian habitat on the waterways. We are looking for more landowners in that area, and that's, and there's a lot of alfalfa also south of West Sacramento, where there's a lot of hawk habitat near the Bogle Winery and other places like that, so that's a priority area for us as well. And then obviously there's areas between West Sacramento and Davis too, that are important. And then probably the most important that I almost forgot to mention is the Yolo Bypass. To your point. The Yolo Bypass is actually excellent habitat for the giant garter snake, and it also provides habitat, which is not part of our plan, for migrating waterfowl. And the giant garter snake uses both the wetlands and the rice fields that are in the bypass. And there's an effort, obviously, as Commissioner Liebig mentioned, to integrate fish habitat into the rice and wetlands habitat. So that's obviously one of your borders as well. And there will be a lot of giant garter snake conservation that is occurring along with the fish habitat conservation in the future. So those are some examples.
That's great. Thank you very much for sharing that. And I'll end on a personal note. So I actually grew up in a very rural, unincorporated area in the Bay Area. So I grew up probably 15, 20 minutes away from Sand Hill Road, right? So where all the big tech investors are. And I went back home, and because the home that I lived in is directly adjacent to preserved open space, dozens and dozens and dozens of acres around the community that I grew up in have been pristinely preserved. And I'm really hoping that this is a gift that we're going to give to future generations, that we'll still have beautiful, vineyards, ag land, delta, and bypass. So that's a really special gift. So thank you very much for your efforts. And with that, I think we'll close. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so that is the end of our regular agenda. Any informal discussion? So adjourned.